So, hello, everybody. I would like to thank Professor Andrei Kozinets and Vitor Lengruber for the invitation to talk to the students of Far East Federal University about the theme of my latest book, Russia, Europe, or Asia. The full title of the book is Russia, Europe, or Asia? The question of Russia's identity in the discussions between Westernizers, Slavophiles, and Eurasianists, and an analysis of the consequences in present-day Russia. The book is composed of two parts. In the first part, I trace the formation of the schools of thought about this question, whether Russia is basically an European country, an Asian country, part of the West, part of the East. There are three main schools of thought about that in Russia: the Westernizers, the Slavophiles, and Eurasianists. And I think I trace the formation of these schools of thought in detail because these debates are not very well known in the West. Most people in the West don't know much about those authors. And in the final part, I use the knowledge from these debates and apply it to the present situation of Russia today. How do these debates influence Russian leaders in their taking of decisions, especially what regards foreign policy? So in this talk, I'm going to follow the outline of the book. First, I'll talk about the formation of the schools of thought about this question, and then I'll apply it to the situation today. It's very difficult to find an objective answer to this identity dilemma in Russia. Is Russia basically an European country, an Asian country? Maybe neither. It's neither Europe nor Asia. It's a unique civilization, or maybe it's a combination of both. It's very difficult to find an objective answer to that. Take geography, for example. As far as territory, Russia is basically an Asian country. More than 75% of its territory lies in Asia. Now, as far as population, it's the other way around. You know, more than 75% of Russia's population live in the European part of Russia, which is more densely populated. Subjectively, you know, these discussions led to the formation of three main schools of thought about this question. You know, Westernism, Slavophilism, and Eurasianism. Maybe the beginning of all these questions were at the times of Peter the Great. Peter pursued modernization reforms in Russia in the 18th century, but that was a very specific type of modernization. It was a westernizing modernization. Along with modernization came a very strong westernization, a very radical and even violent westernization of the country. After Peter died, Russians were divided in their opinion about what Peter had done, whether it was good or bad. At first, these debates were fragmented, scattered, but then there was an episode that catalyzed the formation of the first two schools of thought about this question. It was the publication of Pyotr Shadaev's first philosophical letter. Pyotr Shadaev was a Russian philosopher who had been to Europe and wrote several of what he called philosophical letters. He wrote 8 of them, and at first they circulated in handwritten form because of censorship. But when the first philosophical letter was published in 1836, it caused an uproar in Russia. I'm going to read some short excerpts from the letter, just for you to have an idea why it caused such an uproar. This is Shadaev talking about Russia and Russians. Positioned between the two main parts of the world, East and West, leaning one shoulder on China and the other on Germany, we should merge into ourselves the two great principles of spiritual nature, imagination and reason, and combine in our civilization the history of the whole world. But such a role was not given to us by providence. Solitary in the world, we gave nothing to the world. We taught nothing to it. We did not introduce any idea into the mass of ideas of humanity. We have not contributed to the progress of human reason. One of the most deplorable traits of our peculiar civilization is that we are still discovering truths already assumed by other peoples. The reason is that we never marched together with other peoples. We do not belong to any of the great families of the human race. We are neither West nor East, and we do not have the traditions of any of them. Placed as if out of time, the general education of mankind has not reached us. Well, from these excerpts, you can tell why this letter caused such an uproar in Russia. You know, according to the writer Alexander Herzen, it was the shot in the dark that woke everybody up. When the letter was published, you know, the editor of the magazine was exiled. Pyotr Shadaev was put under house arrest and officially declared crazy by the Tsar himself. So society split after this letter. There was the formation, those debates that were scattered, they crystallized around two main schools of thought that were kind of institutionalized. They had their own journals, their own adherents. It was the Slavophiles and the Westernizers. The Westernizers were those who agreed with Peter. They thought that Russia was basically an European country and should follow the Western path of modernization. The Slavophiles didn't agree with Shadaev's negative picture of Russia. They thought that Russia was neither Europe nor Asia. It was a world in its own. It was a unique civilization, and therefore it should not copy either Europe or Asia. The third school of thought about this question, Eurasianism, was formed in the 1920s. It was formed in the white emigration, the people who had fled Russia after the 1917 Russian Revolution. People like Prince Nikolai Trubetskoy, the famous linguist, the geographer Pyotr Shadaev, Dmitry Mirsky, and others. The Eurasianists thought that the strength of Russia was exactly the combination of the European Slavic element with the Asian Turco-Mongol element. What they were doing is they were actually retrieving the Mongol rule over Russia in a positive light. You know, the Mongols dominated Russia for 2 centuries, from the 13th century to the 15th century. And the Mongol rule over Russia is usually seen as very negative because of destruction wrought by wars. It's usually seen as negative both in the West and in Russia, frequently. But the Eurasianists reclaimed this heritage of the Mongols, and they said that the Mongols had had a positive contribution to Russian society. They said that before the Mongols, what there was the so-called Kievan state, Rus, as it's called in Russian, Kievan Rus, the Kievan state. The Kievan state, where there were the Eastern Slavs, you know, at that time there was no differentiation between Russians, Ukrainians, and Belarusians. They were, you know, the same peoples. They formed the Eastern Slavs. They said that the Kievan state was culturally flourishing, but it was militarily weak, because it was disunited. It was a decentralized state. It was actually like a loose confederation of city-states, something like ancient Greece. And therefore, it was militarily weak. It was disunited, and it was conquered by other peoples, by the Mongols. And the Eurasianists say that the Mongols actually united the disunited Russians. After the Mongol rule came the Muscovite state. And the Muscovite state was very different from the Kievan state. It was a centralized state. It was a very strong state. And it not only expelled the invaders, but it also created a big empire. So, and the Eurasianists say that without the Mongol contribution, that would not be possible. Without the Mongol contribution, the Kievan state would continue as it was, maybe culturally flourishing, but disunited, decentralized, and weak, and therefore would be conquered by other peoples. So they think that the strength of Russia is exactly the combination of the European Slavic Slavic element and the Asian Turco-Mongol contribution. So those are the three main schools of thought, and they guide much of the discussion in Russia today. Before I go on to the application of these debates on Russia on Russia today, I want to make a little observation, because usually when I present my thesis, many people say, "Oh, those are historical debates." But nowadays, very rarely do you find a Russian that says, "Oh, I am a Westernizer," or "Oh, I am a Slavophile." But I think those concepts, although those are historical debates, they still influence the thinking of Russians, the Russian leaders, the Russian people today. When Russians think about this dilemma, this identity dilemma, about Russia between East and West, between Europe and Asia, they don't start from scratch. They don't start from nothing. They don't start from a void. They start from centuries of thinkers, very serious thinkers, debating about these questions. So they are influenced by these debates, and therefore these concepts are very important even today. It's a little, I trace a parallel to a concept like neoliberals or neoliberalism. I have never seen one economist in the world that says, "I am a neoliberal." I've never seen, not even one. But that doesn't mean that the concept of neoliberalism is not a heuristically valid, heuristically useful concept to explain a kind of economic thinking, that gathered strength, especially from the 1970s on, and which retrieves in a positive light many of the tenets of classical liberalism and applies them in a new guise to the new realities of the 1970s onwards. So I think, just like this concept of neoliberalism, even though you can't find the self-avowed neoliberal around, is important. And I also think these concepts of Westernizers, Slavophiles, and Eurasianists are important in present-day Russia too. So I especially investigate the figure of Putin, because Putin is a very important figure today, and he definitely has strong influence on Russian foreign policy. According to the Russian constitution, the foreign policy is a domain of the president of Russia. Most observers classify Putin either as a Slavophile, because he often clashes with the West, or a Eurasianist, because his contributions, to the projects of Eurasian integration that are going on. But I hold a minority view. I hold that Putin is a moderate Westernizer. And here the qualifier moderate is very important because Putin came after Yeltsin. Yeltsin was a much more open Westernizer. Yeltsin actively sought integration with the West. So Putin coming after Yeltsin, for some, he doesn't look like a Westernizer at all in comparison to Yeltsin. But he is what I call a moderate Westernizer. That's important, a moderate Westernizer. Why do I consider him a moderate Westernizer? Putin, all people are multidimensional. No, Putin is not only a Westernizer, but he also, we're going to see, a pragmatic politician. So that's why, for example, he doesn't take sides very much in these disputes about Westernizers, Slavophiles, and Eurasianists. It's very rare that you see an utterance from him taking sides in this debate because he's a pragmatic politician. He knows that among Russians there is no consensus on this topic. So if he takes sides of one school, he risks alienating the adherents of the others. So it's very difficult to find utterance, open utterance from him. But I can trace some things. Why do I believe he's a moderate Westernizer? First of all, he was born in Peter, as Russians call, St. Petersburg, Leningrad, which is the window to the West, right? Peter the Great is one of Putin's idols. He has a bust of Putin. He has a bust of Peter the Great in his office. I can hardly imagine a Slavophile or even a Eurasianist, having Peter the Great as their idol and having a bust of him in their office. There is a book. A kind of a autobiography of Putin that was published in Russia with the title At Pierwsza Litsa, and it was published in English with the title First Person. It was Putin telling his life to 3 Russian journalists. So it's kind of an autobiography of Putin as he tells his life to these Russian journalists. And on page 155 of the English edition, Putin says some words about this question. And he says this, I quote literally, "We Russians are part of European culture. In fact, we derive our value exactly from that. Wherever our people dwell, whether in the Far East or in the South, we are Europeans." So that's clearly a Westernizing position, a Westernizer's position. I was forming my opinion about Putin as a moderate Westernizer, from these published sources. But then I also had a personal experience which clinched this position I hold. In 2004, there was a big meeting in Brazil between Russian and Brazilian businessmen, academics, politicians, a very big meeting. And at that time, I had the opportunity to talk to Igor Shuvalov, who was then an advisor to Putin. Later he became, deputy prime minister of Russia for like 10 years. But at that time, he was just an advisor to Putin. And I asked him, what was Putin's position in this question? And he said that, although Putin doesn't talk openly about that, in their meetings of their inner circle, Putin always said that Russians are Europeans, and there's no reinventing the wheel there. So, all those things lead me to think that Putin is actually a moderate Westernizer. And then somebody might say, oh, how can he be a Westernizer if he's clashing so often with the West? There is almost like a Cold War atmosphere right now between Russia and the West. I'm going to go on to specific episodes where I'm going to try to explain that Putin is not anti-West a priori. When I say that Putin is a moderate Westernizer, what I mean is not that Putin is a servile follower of everything Western. No, what I mean is that Putin is not anti-West a priori. That's my main contention. If he were a Slavophile or certain strands of Eurasianism, he might be anti-West a priori, but he's not, you know, and I'm going to defend this position. And before we go on to the specific episodes, I just want to also make another observation. When I say that Putin is a Westernizer, it's very important to notice that Putin is not a liberal. Just like in the West, not everybody in the West is liberal. The same way in Russia, not all Westernizers are liberals. Putin, I said that Putin, like everybody else, is multidimensional. You know, besides being a Westernizer, he's a pragmatic politician. And besides being a Westernizer and a pragmatic politician, he's also a gasudarstvenik. Gasudarstvenik, that's a Russian term that means, you know, the people who defend a strong state, you know, for Russia. They are defenders of a strong state as the best way to improve society. So, and Putin is a gasudarstvenik. And there's no contradiction in that. There is a long tradition of Westernizers who are gasudarstvenik. Actually, historically, most Westernizers were gasudarstvenik. They were not individualist liberals. If you take in the 19th century, Konstantin Kavelin, Boris Chicherin, and even Sergei Solovyov, those were Westernizers, but they believed in the beneficial effects of the state to carry on beneficial reforms for society. So, and that explains a lot of the behavior of Putin. What I'm going to explain more in details a little later is that Putin is not anti-West a priori. And the times when he clashes with the West, and usually it's a clash with the United States, actually. Usually Europe comes along the United States. That doesn't mean he's anti-West a priori. He's just defending the interests of the Russian state as he sees them, because he's a gasudarstvenik. If somebody impinges on the interests of the Russian state, in his view, it doesn't matter whether from the West or from the East, he's going to defend the interests of the Russian state. I trace a parallel with Charles de Gaulle, the French president. You know, Charles de Gaulle often clashed with the United States, but that didn't mean that Charles de Gaulle was anti-West a priori. Charles de Gaulle was also a gasudarstvenik. He was defending the interests of the French state when he was clashing with the United States. But that doesn't mean he was anti-West a priori. So the same thing with Putin. When Putin clashes with the West, and it's mainly the United States, it doesn't mean he's anti-West a priori. We're going to see the episodes. I'm going to talk about that. It's because he's a gasudarstvenik. And if there are threats coming, it doesn't matter whether from the West or from the East, he will defend the interests of the Russian state as he understands them. And so we can see in the episodes, why do I hold that he's not anti-West a priori? Because when we take a look, when we see the times when the West, namely the United States, approached Russia with a more collaborative attitude, without hidden agendas, usually Putin reacted very positively. Take, for example, September 11. After September 11, Russia helped the West, helped the United States, you know, with the information. He let American planes land in Central Asia to refuel on their way to Afghanistan. So it was positive. Remember the time of the reset policy, during Obama and Hillary Clinton, the famous reset button, the famous Perigruska, Perizagruska button. It was Russia also reacted positively at that time. So we see that the times when the West comes without hidden agendas in a more collaborative way, usually Russia responds positively, Russia under Putin. Now, there are times, when we see the times when there is a lot of tension with the West, especially with the United States, from the Russian point of view, they were not anti-West a priori. They didn't start it. The main thing is NATO expansion. That's something that, and it's not only Putin, many Russians can't understand. NATO was a cold military alliance from the times of the Cold War. So it's military alliance of the Cold War against Soviet Union. Now there's no more Cold War. After there was no more Cold War, there's no more Soviet Union. So one would think that NATO would either dwindle or disappear. No, what use for a military alliance of the Cold War when there is no Cold War? But NATO not only dwindled or disappeared, but it enlarged. There was an enlargement of NATO, and coincidentally towards Russia. It's not only Putin. Many Russians can't understand that. Let's take the latest big crisis, the Ukraine. In the West, this is a tale told as of Putin Russia impinging on the Ukraine. But the story is much more complicated than that. From the Kremlin point of view, things were going fine with Ukraine, and until 2014. There was an elected president that happened to be pro-Russian. He was democratically elected, and all of a sudden he was toppled by non-constitutional means. And it came in the wake of many other similar instances when the so-called color revolutions, when in many countries there was an elected pro-Russian president and he was toppled, and there came an anti-Russian president. From the Kremlin point of view, they didn't start it. They didn't impinge on Ukraine in the beginning. It was one more of those color revolutions, and then they took measures against it. When somebody could say, "Oh, it was a popular revolution in Kiev that toppled the former pro-Russian president Yanukovych," but then people can also say that people in eastern Ukraine, the ethnic Russians, also are having their own popular revolution and not accepting the popular revolution in Kiev. So we start having here a vicious cycle. So my point is in this book, I'm trying to get out of this vicious cycle, and I think there is a way out of it. I'm trying to point out that if you study not only Putin, Russian history, and all these debates, Putin, he's not anti-West a priori. Actually, he's a moderate Westernizer. So there are alternatives to the present path of, most Western politicians think that Putin is either a Slavophile or an anti-West Eurasianist, and therefore the only path that's possible is confrontation with Russia or containment. But if you realize that Putin is not anti-West a priori, that actually he's a moderate Westernizer, that opens new possibilities for less bellicose paths, for more collaborative ways of dealing with Russia if we understand her better. So I think that's my main point, that Putin is not anti-West a priori, and it's very important and has consequences. Okay, thank you very much, and I think now we can open for discussions.